for questions, I think you'll have to come here and speak to in this microphone, so that our online audience will.
Not really. Yeah,
No.
Spread one of the.
Just okay. One of the. So we can give one of the microphones. Yeah. Okay. So I think I saw a hand there. Yeah. Yes, please. If you could also maybe introduce yourself, that will be helpful.
Hi, my name is Sandeep. I'm a first semester student of ICD. Thank you, that was a very engaging conversation. My question is to Felix. You made a passing remark that democracy in the modern times may not have so much of an appealing offer to make, and therefore nations and societies are gravitating towards thought control systems. Is this backed by studies also? Do you really think that there's a downward slide in acceptance for democracy, and that increasingly the world is tending to move towards a more authoritarian pole, would you say?
I think we're good for now. I think we can just address this question straight away.
Yes, indeed. It was a passing and maybe slightly flippant remark, but it's backed by several studies at this point. I mean, it's on the one hand backed by the obvious voting behavior. People who vote for parties across countries such as Poland, the United States, but also parts of Germany, who vote for parties who very openly say that they are going to scale down the practice of democracy by rendering, the independence of judges, making that void, by collapsing the separation of power. And beyond the voting behavior, it's also backed by data that, for instance, we have generated in my project, but it's also in other research projects. When you speak to people about, what's the value of democracy? What do you make of democracy? Are you satisfied with the idea of democracy? In the first quarter of the 21st century, increasingly what we see is a gap between an ideal of democracy where individuals expect their own desires to be immediately imprinted on parliamentary debates, and that can only fail, right? I mean, that's not how parliamentary debate works. That's not how political decision-making works in a democracy. But what we see in focus groups and in-depth interviews is that people contrast this expectation with the reality of, democracy doesn't deliver for me. And that frustration is particularly strong among individuals in the project that we did with a migration background from Russia, be they living in Canada or Germany, but also Estonia. These are our 3 cases, by the way. And it's particularly strong among those individuals who also buy into the revisionist narratives about history. So there are obviously also other individuals who fully endorse the self-critical perspective on history that is primarily being taught in schools in those 3, especially in Germany. In Canada, Estonia, the story is a bit different. They would be less prone to signing with such critical statements. But I think the link to today's session is really important, that the view an individual looks at the lessons of history has a very direct impact, or at least a correlation to their attitudes towards democracy. So unfortunately, it's more than anecdotal, it's more than the voting behavior, but it's actually a disappointment with the very idea of democracy that is spreading, I would say.
Thank you. Thank you, Felix. Thank you for your question. Do you have any further questions in the audience? Yes, please. Hedda, maybe if you could help again.
Hello, my name is Grace and I'm from the US. I am also an ICD student in my first semester. This question goes for the whole panel. I would say, in your opinion, looking at the history of the fall of the Soviet Union and the establishment of certain organizations like the EU, NATO, we have seen that there has been a lot of exclusion when it comes to including Russia in certain Western organizations and platforms. In your opinion, in hindsight, how would you say that the West, the European Union, Brussels, and the US could have been more inclusive in including Russia in such organizations, so that there would not be such a fierce Russia versus the West competition that we are seeing such a large rise in? Thank you.
Who would like to start?
Well, I can't imagine how we could have been even more inclusive towards Russia. Because for decades, the West tried to actually cooperate with Russia, and there was this idea of, peace through cooperation, peace through trade, and so on, a false conviction that if Russia sees steady economic growth and, the growing real incomes of the population, it will become a more stable and democratic country and so on. We know it. What was the effect? That a large part of the money earned through this cooperation with the West was invested into the army, right, into the propaganda and brainwashing of young and elder generations. So I don't think we could have been more inclusive. I think we were too short-sighted, and we continued to support the growingly oppressive and repressive and aggressive regime throughout its wars against Chechnya, against Georgia, against Ukraine in 2014. And I think that precisely the lack of reaction of the West towards the Russian growing aggressiveness has led us to this full-scale war, not only against Ukraine, but this is the war above all against the West, and they have been speaking about it for several years at least. So I think this is but your question is super interesting because it's precisely the question that the Kremlin is asking all over and over again in this propaganda also addressed to the West, that it's your fault, the West's, that you sort of cheated on us, and we feel disappointed, and you didn't respond to our fears. I mean, fears are also a very subjective term, a very manipulative term, because these concerns about Russia's security is actually about the deepest concern of this oppressive regime that some neighbors can become truly sovereign. This is about Ukraine and others. So I think that it was too little deterrence and containment and not too little inclusion. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I would say when it comes to the questioning itself, historians would hardly tell why, but rather how. And it seems to me, if we look closely on the events of the fall of the Soviet Union and all the emergence of the new states, it was really super fast and unpredictable for both the internal, let's say, actors as well to the foreign observators, especially the US and European countries. Therefore, there was never actually a plan to financial assistance to late Gorbachev's USSR because nobody was understanding what's going on, why it's going so fast, and what's happening with the market reforms. Are there going to be market reforms or not? And then Russia remained quite unstable and unpredictable through the 90s, and therefore any kind of cooperation, of course, I mean, there have been efforts from the side of the US and European countries, but the thing is, there was no, I guess, new strategy after the USSR collapsed. I mean, and the problems which both European countries and US were facing in the 90s were also serious. I mean, Russia was not that much of a focus for US in the 1991, 1993, because US a lot of do with its economy and domestic issues and the, let's say South America issues as well. And after all, Russia was just not in focus. And I mean, this lack of strategy wouldn't be much of a problem itself, because if Russia would be stable enough and establish democratic institutions, it would be just a cooperative action to establish a new system of relations. But the thing is that on one hand, the Americans and Europeans, I guess, were accepting and adjusting to the new reality after the collapse of USSR, which happened really quickly and unpredictable. At the same time, Russians, unfortunately, Russian state wasn't really democratically established and stable, and therefore it was more like adjusting to new reality step by step, and no strategic vision, and especially no any established wish of Russia to be included in the structures and just follow the path. So I guess if both the US and Europe had a strategy, like a new one rebranded after the collapse of USSR, and if Russia was more democratic and stable and established democracy, it could be different, but it happened differently, unfortunately.
Okay, I'll take that question slightly more narrowly, Grace, with the focus on the extent to which one could have maybe integrated the Russian memory regime into the European one. And I think there's one kind of overarching lesson to take from the experience of also European Union's attempts at integrating different national and regional memory histories. And that is that it's extremely hard to work on that supranational integration of competing views on history. And you see it over the pain to establish, for instance, the European House of History, which took forever and which is extremely boring, the final results that emerged, just because it was impossible to actually agree on what the messages are of Europe's 20th century history. And this is within a union which shares to a large extent the way we govern, the way we look at our society, and the way we interact with one another. But even in that setting, it's extremely difficult. So now you imagine, if you add the regime differences on top, that makes the dialogue even more difficult. And we had attempts. I mean, there were Polish-Russian historian commissions that took for, I think it was 3 decades of work that took place between historians from those two countries, and several texts were being produced, but it didn't lead to any form of kind of exchange that also integrated the perspective on the other of one's own national history. So it did not lead to this entangled dialogue between different versions of history. And I think the mistake that we do as also academics very often is that we take this reductionist Franco-German experience of, oh, well, these two countries, they chatted with one another, they wrote a joint history textbook, and now they're friends. But that is not replicable easily to regimes that differ so much. And it's unfortunately being used for the Israeli-Palestinian dialogue on history as well, this Franco-German reconciliation model, but it doesn't make sense, right? I mean, that only worked because both countries were economically so deeply integrated when the historical dialogue started, and there was a shared institutional framework, meaning it was after European integration was already very far advanced. So that's the first kind of conceptual problem that we have with integrating transnational memory. The second point is, I think that European leaders, and that's not to blame them, but they misjudged the extent to which integrating Central and East European perspectives into the European memory regime will harden the border to the Russian Federation in terms of memory. So when the Baltics, Poland, and so on joined the European Union, they also joined with their perspectives on 20th century history. And one key difference to how the non-enlarged EU looked at the Second World War and the then enlarged European Union looked at the Second World War was the status of the crimes of Stalin. Because for France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, London, the crimes of Stalin were irrelevant, right? They were kind of a footnote, but they didn't really contribute to the European memory regime that emerged after, I would say, after the 70s. But that changed in 2004, and especially the Baltics, but also Poland, brought their own perspectives on how we have to recalibrate, how we think about what actually is World War II, how long did it last, how long is what happened after 45 in occupation or not. And the European Union developed in ways that gave more visibility also in the legal documents to the way the Baltic countries and Central East European countries look at the history of Stalinism. And that set in motion a process of dissociation between Russia and the West that was much more profound than anyone anticipated in the West. That is then when you have Russia starting to create memory laws that make what became the norm in Europe make it illegal to say in Russia. So the comparison between Hitlerism and Stalinism, which became with the 23rd August commemoration, the resolution on the 23rd of August, the date of the signing of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, which became kind of, that's the European standard, that these two regimes are to a very large extent comparable and intent very similar. This is illegal in Russia. But the Russian decision is a reaction to what happened in Brussels. And that is a dynamic that the European Union totally misjudged. Should they have done it differently based on where we stand now? That's a very political question, which I think academics are not so good at answering. But they misjudged that, and it's a driving factor in the escalation over memory between Russia and the West.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Willem Noué, former European Commission. I worked on enlargement a lot actually, and I can only confirm what you said, Felix, about the wave also of new colleagues that we had at the time, especially in 2004. In a way, Russia wasn't even the perception in the Commission that the Russian wasn't really even a factor. We had new member states to deal with, and they had prime of place above all. But the new colleagues brought, indeed, they bring their own whole culture and history with them, and that impacts the functioning of the EU. And especially Poland, which is by far the most important new member state in terms of size and how it developed as well. So I can only confirm that. My question actually is on Anna. You mentioned, well, I mean, if I look as an economist to the Russian economy, it's like watching a train crash in slow motion. With the high interest rates, the unstable ruble, the high inflation. And this also hits, of course, particularly, I think, groups that used to support Putin, like pensioners, like agriculture, small companies maybe as well, because they can't invest anymore. The investment is dead. And people, well-educated people leaving Russia. I mean, the economy is battered from all sides, and it's running on empty, basically. Now, I also read recent news items about how apparently there's more and more grumbling being more openly expressed, even Russia itself. But you also mentioned that, well, the Russian economy, or Russia has always shown this incredible capacity for maybe suffering and adaptation. So my question is actually, do you think that this closing collapse of the economy might finally start making a difference, or looking at Russian history, you say, well, no, that's not going to happen because in the past they had similar, and it never happened that way either. Thank you.
Well, I don't think that the Russian economy may collapse as such, but I think that with sanctions and with as fast as possible a decoupling from Russian economy, we can undercut the financial foundation for the war, and this should be our aim. I don't think that Russian society will be a crucial political factor. I mean, yes, they are. There is a growing discontent. Yes, Russians are starting to see that they are paying more and more for the war, while the initial idea of the government was to pretend nothing particular is happening and society can live normally and the war is somewhere far from here. But I think that what will happen within the ruling elite or in the army will have a much more impact on the future of this war or peace. Well, basically, I think that the worse the economic conditions of Russia, the better the chance that they, at certain point, they will have to stop the war, right? But they have this high ability of downward adaptation. And what I see is the beginning of this guns or butter dilemma, and the cuts on social policy have begun. But I think that it's the army we should maybe have a closer look at, because I think that a combination of economic hardship and a series of defeats, only this combination can impact the situation to some extent, because as long as Russians strongly believe in their ultimate victory, and they do, it's not only about propaganda, but because the propaganda can offer them actually some minor facts to support this narrative, nothing will change. There was a very interesting survey of public opinion by the government-sponsored VTIOM recently, and they show that around, I hope I'm not mistaken, 80% of Russians said, the majority of Russians in general, said they are ready to some economic hardship and some sacrifice in order to help the fatherland in this defensive war, right? So this is a very bad sign. I'm not sure if this VTIOM survey is a part of a pro-war propaganda, because they might be manipulating the data as well, right? But this is also a signal forming the public attitudes, right? They see that the majority supports sacrifice, so okay, we want to be a part of majority. So this is really a complicated topic. But I became quite, I got some new hope with the new American sanctions. If they properly work, it might influence somehow the situation with time.
It's way beyond the panel's topic, of course, and it's a debate that has been going on now for long. I think I have a slightly different take on it. My impression is that increasingly it looks a little bit like a tape that is stuck kind of at the same moment on that tape, and we return to, well, another wave of sanctions. These sanctions, had they been implemented in February 2022 or March, they would have probably killed the Russian economy. But at this point, the market has adapted so much, and the Russian society has adapted so much, and the mafia has benefited tremendously from the ways of getting goods into the Russian Federation, that I'm quite skeptical about sanctions bringing an end to that war, to be honest, because the Russian society, as Maria said, is not on the verge of mobilizing to bring down that regime, far from it, and the economy, I think the costs that the regime is willing to take are way higher than what the West is willing to pay, because all these sanctions have a backfire effect on Western societies, and that's where destabilization occurs on Western societies, be it purchasing power and the rise of the far right or the far left, and that's something that kind of holds European leaders in a certain restraint on being more far-reaching. So yeah, I'm a bit more skeptical on that, but I mean, history will tell, right, to what extent sanctions were a causal factor in bringing an end to the war.
I'll also maybe make a short comment to this question before we proceed with the further questions. I also have a feeling that, ever since 2022, we have the statements like, oh, Russian economy is on the brink of collapsing. Russian economy is on the brink of collapsing, right? So we keep hearing this story. And I think, as Felix had mentioned, it's a bit difficult to look at the current situation from the future, like what the fact will be. But here I would like to maybe connect to one of the points which Felix also made earlier, and that is the world does not consist only of the so to say, the global north or the west, right? And we saw the reactions of many countries of the global south to the war in Ukraine, and also to economic sanctions, the way they didn't join sanctions, and in a way, a lot of these countries also help parallel import and parallel export to Russia, and from Russia, have all the stories of a number of countries buying Russian oil and reselling it, their own oil, or buying, electronic products for themselves and reselling it to Russia. So in a way, this, plus Russia reorienting its exports a lot for the new markets, including a lot of, natural resources, which also happened, to a large extent. Plus, obviously, the whole macroeconomic situation when, the Russian government investing so much into the military sector, and then this money just doesn't end in there, right? It goes further into economy. It does go further into economy. So in a way, I almost would say the situation is a bit more difficult. The situation is maybe not what like a lot of experts would have hoped. It's not as good as maybe the Russian government would have hoped, but it's also not as bad as we, like many probably of us sitting here in the audience, would have hoped. And also maybe I certainly agree with what Maria was saying about the two decisive factors of being the Russian elites and the army. I would also agree to it, saying those could be the two decisive factors. And maybe also commenting on the polls, on this, the way sociology works in Russia now is it's, you would not call it a real picture of life, right? And it's not only that, imagine for every poll, Tseom probably talks to 2,000 people, 3,000 people. And it's not only about Tseom, which is trying to promote a particular state agenda. It's also very often people saying what is being expected of them. And that's, I think, is a real challenge to a lot of polls we hear from Russia, because people don't really answer, because people are so much now have this fear that, okay, I'd better not say something wrong. So they just say what expected to them. So I almost feel like the regular sociology with very short polls probably doesn't work in Russia at all. There are a number of groups which are trying to try this different sociology with in-depth interview. I'll just mention one of them. It's called Public Sociology Lab, PS Lab. They're the ones who do hundreds of thousands in-depth interviews on a lot of topics. And if you want to get a story or a picture of Russian society now is probably redirected to, this is not the only group, but it's like one of them. Hera, sorry.
My name is Andrei Vinogradov. I'm a postdoc at the Leibniz Institute for Eastern European History and Culture in Leipzig. And my question was already partially asked, but I would like to historicize the discussion a bit. And my question would address to all the speakers. It's also about economic questions, economic side of this war in Ukraine. And I think, Maria, you mentioned in your talk that it is important to make Russian society pay for this bloody war, which is true, but I think on the other side of this question, Putin's regime would agree with that. Because like this is what they try to do, get more money from the Russian people to wage this war. And I think what is really important in this case is how we can make Russian society, Russian people understand what they are actually paying for. And how we can actually contribute to this discussion as historians, which historical arguments we can use to like show also on the Russian example that democracy is more sustainable than empire, and that this is something that Russia can also do, not only European countries, but that this is the way to the Russian state, not to just build an empire, but also try to do something more democratic and more sustainable. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Hedda, I saw your hand. Do you want to just give a follow-up question, or because we don't have so much time? Yeah, okay, maybe.
Yes, so I'm Hedda Hedlund from Historians Without Borders, and our NGO is based in Finland, so this is actually coming from a little bit of a Finnish experience. As some of you maybe know, we have quite a long border with Russia and some history there as well. In the recent years, we've had this kind of escalating memory war in the media, especially on the Russian side. And of course, what is somehow interesting and important to notice there is that usually the topics that are discussed and somehow pushed forward from the Russian side are, of course, topics that are also difficult for Finnish memory politics, concerning the Second World War, collaborating with Nazi Germany, etc., things like that. So I think this is a question for the Finnish case, but I think also for other countries which have these histories with Russia, is that how can we in our democratic societies become more somehow better in dealing with our difficult pasts, so there's less ground for this kind of memory manipulation. For example, in terms of history education, or in general the memory politics and discussions that we have about history, how can we also become better to deal with these difficult pasts so they cannot be so easily manipulated?
I'll suggest we'll take the third question back there, and then maybe we'll make a round of answers.
Hello, my name's Daniel. I'm a student here. I'm also a journalist.
Can you speak up?
Yes.
To the microphone, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So what can be done by the media to counter the propaganda that is disseminated by Russia?
You mean European media?
Yes. Sure, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
European media. It seems to infect the Balkans more, and more so than up north. What can be done by the media?
Thank you. Maybe just shall we take one final question here in the second round, and then we'll just make a final round
hello.
of
My name is Shadab Dash. I'm from Bangladesh. It's been 3.5 years have gone since Ukraine and Russia war was started. As a country, actually, Bangladesh, I realized actually how devastating economy there was due to this war. I would say it's actually more than COVID-19, actually, I would say. So my question is this war is devastating for economy, country's economy, not only Asia but also Europe, I would say, and also devastating for humanity. So I would say, what's the actually undertaking UN and its friend country has taken or will take to come to end the war? And another question is, what actually, as we are not capable in the meantime to settle this issue in the battlefield, so what actually cultural diplomacy we have taken to end this war by discussing with the Russia and they are actually stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you. I think, unfortunately, we cannot take any further questions at the moment because we already have 4, and I'm not sure everyone's memory is as good. So we'll take these 4 questions and we'll see if I have any time left. But I saw your hand. Who would like to start?
I'll take the Hedda's question first, because I think that's a really important one, this kind of pushing of vulnerabilities. That's a very, very appropriate strategy, right? Because the Kremlin knows exactly where the weaknesses are and what the trigger points are. So it also suggests there's a very careful studying of European societies and discourses that are developing here. I think the answer you always hear from politicians then is civic education. I think that doesn't work. I think that will just repeat or maybe solidify the fragmentation of the societies in the West that we are seeing. One approach that I've come across and that colleagues have studied as well is to very carefully and consciously engage with the contradictions that are part of the histories of our own societies. So in practical terms, that means in Northern Ireland, there's a museum, we go very far from Russia now, in Northern Ireland there's a museum that engages with the Troubles, with the violence of the 1960s and 1970s, where participants of both sides are being put together in front of a school class to discuss about their competing interpretations of history. And by that, you don't reduce memory to this teleological stream of narratives that justifies why we have to do X or Y, but you actually acknowledge that complexity and that it's a matter of perspective, and you teach to school children, or students or the broader public that history is a matter of interpretation and appropriation, and that there's a power struggle in the background. And I think if we want to stay committed to our democratic principles, it's that multi-perspectivity, that entangledness of memory that we need to be giving, that we need to give space to that. Now that is very time consuming, it's extremely costly, and it doesn't happen in a room that is not void of power. Of course, an actor such as Russia, if you bring together a Russian and a Baltic perspective on history, the Russian agents have much more resources to push their view on history, and the Baltics being anyway kind of an absurdity of being an independent country. So you need to push back against that to make sure that all voices are being heard equally. But I think what doesn't work is to suppress kind of that the extent to which there are tensions about the way we look at our 20th century history, and giving space to that in rooms that are well crafted, where educators are working, is for me one of the ways for doing that, because it's, I think, when citizens can navigate through complexities, that new disinformation can also be interpreted by them. That brings me a bit to the second question, and then I'll leave the other questions for my colleagues. I think the extent to which we can do much in media, the only way forward would there to not be democratic. And maybe that's the time to do it. I'm a bit agnostic to that, but free media is very open for manipulation, especially from foreign actors who are not democratic. And that's what we are seeing. And we are seeing in the project that I mentioned how this is happening from the bottom, how the authoritarian narratives don't even need to be pushed by actors whom we know that they belong to the Kremlin, but that the offer of interpretation of history and politics that comes from a state such as Russia, but also Turkey, is being picked up by young people who are co-creating the meaning that the authoritarian regime wishes to spread. And so if you want to work against that, the first thing that I said would be one option, but that's taking a lot of time. The second one is to limit the freedom of speech. And that's a very dangerous debate, of course. It's a very thin ice that we're moving on. But think about the extent to which social media is kind of conducive to disinformation being spread and being taken as the truth. Maybe it's the moment for democratic leaders to think about, what are reasonable limits to free speech that would be required to protect our democracies. And last example, just that I wanted to give, I did an in-depth interview with someone with Russian roots living here in Germany. I was sitting there more or less dressed like that in my office, which has a huge bookshelf and looks like an intellectual's office. And that person was trying to convince me of the way he looks at 20th century history through Tucker Carlson, who is one of the far-right influencers in the US, and connecting his appropriate interpretation of history with a justification of the war in Ukraine, speaking to me. So I'm happy to hear that because it's an interview and you want to know what drives these people. But I think the lesson that is so shocking in it is that there's absolutely no self-censorship. I think 5 years ago, this person would not have spoken to someone like me and put the cards on the table. But that is gone. You don't have self-censorship any longer in interviews. And that person kind of reiterates and speaks about how this is being shared among friends and so on. And I think there the only way is to manage to tone down that stream of information, which is inherently anti-democratic. So that's why it's a very delicate balance. But I think we're a bit naive if we leave that open to democratic deliberation and enlightened citizens who will navigate through the mess of information that they are exposed to, because that person clearly didn't. And I think winning back such a person is a matter of, that's not just a little bit of civic education, but that is a forceful redirection of the news diet of that person, because that person will also not select into reading The Guardian or The Telegraph or whatever people might be reading.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Going just back closely to the question of Heta on the issues on the Russia and its border countries, I guess it's exactly the question of the NATO enlargement in the night is because basically the countries which just left the Eastern Bloc were so much afraid of that Russia or Soviet Union would just emerge again, and I'm afraid that Russia did not do enough to reassure them it would never happen. So I guess the whole question is about trust, and I guess it's really hard to do it only on your side, while the other side is not being trusted enough, and for reasons. I guess the problem here also could be that this threat would also bring a lot of fear, and fear is the best fuel for nationalism. Therefore, going through all this line and keeping it out of nationalistic agenda, but still keeping freedom and therefore trying to renegotiate is a very hard task, and I guess without Russia at the table, the trustable Russia, peaceful Russia is just impossible. Although, of course, the future vision of how it could be, I guess, also needed. And that brings me to the next question on the agency of the Russian society and ability to reach them somehow. I mean, I've been struggling with this, like, I guess, last 3 years working with Russian media like Meduza, Dozhd, Novaya Gazeta Europe, and so forth. And the thing is that it seems that like the approaches we tried to find before as well, the approaches of Western media were unsuccessful to a big extent because they were not really applicable to the current situation. And with the rise in censorship in Russia and the new extremist laws and banning any kind of media which is trying to spread the news is really hard, I guess it's time for us, and we're trying our best to find new formats and approaches because we understand the previous one don't work properly. And I guess it's all about this adjustment and looking for a new invention of format which is still might work. And in our case, we with Yulia Navalny team are trying to form a new narrative of Russian history, which would also focus not only tyrannic parts like Ivan the Terrible or Peter the Great, whatever, but rather on the moments of civil participation in Russian history. But again, this activity and the seek for a new format would require also, I guess, some assistance or at least understanding from our partners on the European side, just that we also might have some value, although we couldn't bring revolution to Russia at the moment. So it's about a long-term strategy and the ability to cooperate and to see the long-term goal, and that is not an easy thing I get to sell to your to those who vote for you, because basically you couldn't sell. Well, we have to pay the Russian journalists so they could do their job, and maybe in 10 years Putin's regime would collapse. But still, I guess, speaking of strategic goals, that's something which is probably needed for future.
How to convince Russians that Russia can become a normal, non-imperial country? Well, I think that Russians don't care about big, noble ideas. They care about their local, everyday problems. So the harsher their life for them is, due to the increasing costs of the war and sanctions and so on, the better the chance that they will maybe come to a conclusion that the late Soviet society came to in late 80s. We can't live like that anymore. When there is this "we can't live like that anymore" syndrome, I think that would be a nice start of some kind of change, but we are still very far from that. And what is also needed is an alternative. As long as Putin is the only play in town, I think that Russians will just sit tight and wait for another better time to come. And we need a collapse of Putin's regime. And we need a fundamental political change in Russia, which is not the same thing. But I would like to remind you that the Western politicians and also a lot of Western experts get immediately paralyzed when they hear this point that we need a collapse of Putin's regime and we need a future leadership of Russia to concentrate on growing domestic problems instead of concentrating on their neighbors. The West is extremely afraid of Russia's destabilization for reasonable reasons, but I think that these reasons are just strongly exaggerated. We basically need pluralism in Russia, which doesn't mean necessarily democracy, just pluralism, an existence of competing narratives, competing interests, and sort of a checks and balance system. The society is deeply intoxicated by this imperial narrative, and there is a strong, let's say, Weimar syndrome that has been stoked by the regime for decades now. I don't know, as I've said, it will take decades to get rid of it, given the favorable conditions. I didn't try to say that sanctions are a silver bullet, but I think they are just raising costs of continuation of this war, and they are also creating strategic dilemmas for the regime, which is important. And if we look at India's reaction to the recent sanctions, actually India's reaction was quite, I would say, favorable to us. But of course, we will have to work hard on the implementation of the sanctions, which is not an obvious question. I think that one of the things that the West totally ignored in the past, and now a large part of the problems we are facing is because of that. There was never a proper, wide-ranging system of sanctions for mass violations of human rights in Russia. We thought it was their domestic problem, and precisely this kind of mass violations of human rights were necessary to suppress all kinds of internal protest and start the full-scale war. So I think that this might be a part of our future strategy. And how to counter Russian propaganda in European media. I think that we need much more strategic communications, of the governments with societies. It has sort of started recently, but it's still too late, too little. And we should change the language with which we describe Russia, the war, Ukraine, and the region and history. I'm going to give you just two examples. Many of us still use this term post-Soviet area or post-Soviet states, over 30 years after the USSR collapse. I think it's just, it fits into Russia's imperial narrative. Another example. Recently, I listened to a German expert, a politician, expert, professor, a well-educated and totally pro-Ukrainian person, who somewhere throughout his speech, he said something like, Germany's attack against Russia in 1941. The consequences are huge. I mean, you know, I understand why the slip of a tongue. I mean, it was like not deliberate, but the German invasion was mostly affecting Belarus and Ukraine. But you know, there is still this narrative about the German guilt vis-a-vis Russia because of 1941. So I think we have here in the West, we have a huge homework to do ourselves. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your questions, for your answers. Now I have one bad news and one good news. The bad news is that unfortunately we cannot take any further questions. We really have to finish the panel now. We have to wrap it up. We're already, I think, 15 minutes beyond our schedule. And yeah, so whatever questions you have, you are welcome to approach our speakers, talk to them, exchange contacts, and just ask them privately. Sorry about that. The good news, however, is that we have coffee break coming. And, you know, we'll be able to reinvigorate ourselves, get some coffee, maybe eat something sweet, talk to each other. And with this, I would like to thank everyone, thank the organizers once again, thank our wonderful panelists. I feel like it's been an amazing discussions. It's been, you know, very thought-provoking discussions, a lot of topics to follow, a lot of new articles to write, new books to write, new, I don't know, podcasts to talk about. And thank you all for your questions, for your engagement, and for your interest. So coffee break, we're back here at 11:30. So quick coffee break. Okay, thank you. Thank you.